Hello, Juhi.
Hi, Mark.
Nice to see you. I am Mark Shapiro, Artistic Director and Conductor of the Chamber Chorus Cantori, New York. And with me is Juhi Bansal, a wonderful composer whose music Cantori will be performing on November 14th and 15th, both at 8 p.m. at Church of the Holy Apostles in New York on Ninth Avenue and West 28th Street. We are loving this piece, and I could mention that it was one of the winners of our composition competition that we had a couple of years ago. And I was not on the jury. We were very careful about that, but I did kind of swoop in at the end and get to contribute an opinion on it. I like this piece so much. So very excited that we are able to program it. So, without further ado, here is Juhi. Juhi, tell us where you are.
I'm calling in from Los Angeles right now. I've lived here now for quite a long time, and it's been a strange year in Los Angeles. So excited to be here and so excited to be just even to Zoom with you about this.
Yeah. And how long have you been in LA?
Oh gosh, 20 something years at this point. I came out for college to go to USC and stayed.
I see. Okay. So tell us first a little bit about this piece. So the title is Four Reflections on the Night. Can you tell us about the genesis of it? Did it start as a set? Did it kind of grow organically on its own? How did it come to be?
It was a genesis of a lot of different things, but I would say probably the thing that kind of ignited it in the first place. LA Opera came to me, this is quite a few years ago, wanting to do some kind of collaboration with the school I was teaching at, which is Pasadena City College, and Caltech choruses, and kind of they just came with this idea, write a piece that is somehow related to the Orpheus legend, and they were doing a big citywide project around this. And I had this lunch meeting with them, and I just remember thinking about how fascinated I was by mythology around the stars, but also because I had grown up in India and then in Hong Kong. There is so much just incredible stories, mythology, even science around the stars and different ways of looking at the constellations that is in some ways the same as, and in some ways different from, and in some ways there was a lot of crossover historically about how these different cultures have looked at the stars. And that sort of became the genesis of this piece for me. Why not look at, you know, as humans, we've looked at the stars for such a long time and told so many stories about what they could be and what they represent in science and our mythology and religion, in all these different ways of reflecting and telling stories. So the piece really became about that. And so with LA Opera, we did this hour-long cantata version of the piece, and I thought, that's a hard project to get people to take on to do. It's a really big commitment to do something of that size. So the piece that you're performing, became kind of a performance excerpt of four of the movements that I thought go together really well and kind of trace the arc of the story.
Okay, now you're whetting my appetite for the rest of it. Okay. To be continued. So a couple of questions from what you were just saying. So tell us the Orpheus legend, just a capsule of that.
It's been so long since I don't want to misspeak it, but more or less, the elements of it, at least the elements of the legend that really stuck with me. One was this imagery of the Lyra constellation up in the sky, you know, um, and Mark, please chime in and help me with this. It has truly been so long since
Okay.
I've actually sat through. I don't want
I
to
think you're
misspeak
doing
it.
just fine. Yeah, okay.
Um, they talk about Orpheus following his wife down into Hades. And, two of the images that really stick with me from the Orpheus legend is, one is that moment where Eurydice, I believe Orpheus turns to look at Eurydice when he's not supposed to look at Eurydice, and he has almost gotten her back up to earth. And then because he turns and looks when he shouldn't, she is now forever doomed, and they're forever separated, even after he's gone through this whole long journey to try and rescue her, which is actually interesting to me for the piece that you're doing. One of the movements that is not in the set of four movements but is in the larger piece, there's similarly a story about kind of star-crossed lovers that comes out of Chinese mythology, where what is it called, the Bridge of Stars, I think it's often translated to in English. And the story is that there was a human lover and this, like, sort of fairy celestial princess, and she came down to Earth. They met, they fell in love, and her mother, who I believe is some kind of like god empress, she decides that they should no longer be together. So she banishes them and separates them in the night sky. And the idea is that he is at some point far, far away, and she is at some point far, far away. And one night every year, there's this bridge that manifests out of the stars where they can cross to each other and be together. And that's kind of a thing that's celebrated. So um, I'm not as well versed, at least these days, on the Greek mythology as I'd like to be. But I remember when I was writing this piece, one of the things that really attracted me was seeing these overlaps that came up across different cultures with similar stories.
Yeah. No, it sounds very clear what you're saying. Um, so I also wonder if you were one of those children who liked to gaze up at the night sky, and did you grow up somewhere where there wasn't too much light and you could actually see the sky? And tell us about that a little bit.
When I was really, really little, we lived in a tiny town called Pinjore in India. And I remember the house we lived in had a flat roof. So you're completely right. I mean, I remember spending nights up there with my family. We would just like sleep out on this flat roof and look at the stars, and it was magical. And then, of course, I moved to the city growing up, and there were no stars at all. So for me, part of what led to this was this rediscovery, really. Once I came out to the States, started backpacking and hiking. And, if you've spent any time in Utah and in the Southwest out in the deserts, when it's dark, it is dark. You really can see everything. And I remember one particular trip. There is a spot outside of Zion National Park, which is well removed from anything else, and it's just these open plateaus. And you wake up in the middle of the night, and it is the most tremendous, magical thing you have ever seen. And I remember thinking I have to do something about that with music. And then it kind of just came together when LA Opera approached me about this piece.
So I guess it's a bit of a cliche, but listening to you, it sounds like nature does inspire you.
Absolutely. It's funny. I think about that a lot because it is in some ways a cliche. On the other hand, I think, nature is such a huge part of how we all relate to the world. Either you're in a city or you're surrounded by natural things, but really that's such a human element of how we exist in the world. We relate to nature. So I don't know. I think of it as almost more of a human connection, and that also became something that's important in the piece itself.
Interesting. I want to talk a little bit about at least the style of music that this piece seems to have. Um, before I say much more, can you sort of speak to how you think about the compositional process, your idiom in this piece, your approach?
That is a great question that I don't think I've thought about a lot. At least not since I wrote the piece, which now is a few years ago, so my
Yeah.
memory is a little fuzzy. Some broader things I can say about my style that I think do show up in this piece. I mean, as I mentioned, I grew up in India. I grew up listening to Hindustani classical music. My mom worked in that style. Then I went to school in Hong Kong, and I remember studying Chinese music alongside Western classical music. And then I came here and was studying as a composer. So all that to say, I think my musical style in general draws on a lot of different things. So, we're writing this piece is for a classical chorus. So I do work in some ways very traditionally, thinking about form and thinking about harmony and thinking about structure. But there's also a lot of aleatory in this piece,
Hmm. Tell us
which
what that means.
it is giving some element of choice in the music. So the way it manifests in this particular piece is singers have a lot of leeway in certain sections about so what text they might sing. They have a few options about the rhythmic pacing. And the reason I do that is to create kind of different textures.
Mhm.
So in the piece, it's like I know I want a cumulative texture that sounds like, just as an example, a bunch of voices that are really loud and kind of cacophonous. That's very easy to create with aleatory because I don't have to have singers desperately trying to follow all the 30-second notes and do things in time. I can just tell them create a cacophony with some limitations on pitch and rhythm.
I'm interested in that. I think there's always a tension with composers between trying to a very, very detailed notation and the kind of aleatoric options you're talking about. And often, from the point of view of the listener, the results can be very similar. And for the point of view of what you were just saying, the psychology of the performer, it's a completely different process. So that you're not sort of glued to the page, but you're flexibly moving within a certain space. Can you speak to your own feeling when you compose of notating versus notating a space in which certain things can happen?
Sure. I mean, I used to be a performer. I definitely am no longer a performer, but I used to be a performer. I used to sing. I used to play the piano. I used to play the violin. It's really important to me to write things that actually feel good to sing and play and perform. And, I feel like just to what you said from a listening experience, if two things sound very, very similar, and one of them requires absolute, like glued to the music, hoping desperately you don't get lost, and one gives you the freedom to just bring things to life with your voice within certain parameters. I will always choose the version that lets you have the freedom to perform and sing and make music the way that feels most natural.
I think
Um,
so interesting. And um, I'm almost thinking it's like a West Coast, East Coast thing, but it's I think there is such a fetish around notating in some ways. And I think if people are notating, it has to be exactly what you want, but it doesn't mean that everything has to be notated. So in that way. So I think that is interesting. Um, and it is interesting, the psychology of the performers. Some people get very anxious when they have certain freedom.
yeah.
And I think that's a challenge in our system. What were you going to say?
I was just thinking, I mean, I feel so strongly that notation, even when you notate every single thing, quote unquote, exactly as you want it, you can't really notate everything. There is always an element of the performer needs to lift this off the page and bring life to it in a way that you just cannot give every detail. So my approach is just to lean into that rather than to try
Yeah,
to force it.
it's great. And I think the singers really appreciate it. I think it feels like your body has a certain ease of living in the music, which I think then translates into the way it sounds, which is really nice. When we were talking about your musical style and the influences that you mentioned, something I'm very struck by, um, on the one hand, we talked about harmony, but on the other, your use of rhythm and I think of texture is really interesting. And I wonder if you could speak a little more to your use of rhythm and texture.
Sure. Okay, so this is kind of a funny story. I was a choral singer for a long time growing up. I used to do some choral conducting, and somehow I went 15, 18 years in my composition career without ever writing a choral piece.
Wow.
So this is my first choral piece. So
No,
before I know, and I remember getting this commission for an hour-long choral cantata, having never written a choral anything before. Um, but so, of course, I had my background as a choral singer to lean on and as a choral conductor, and it's not that it was a big switch, but a lot of what wound up informing this piece because of that is my experience writing for orchestras and chamber ensemble. And I think that's where, you were talking about rhythm and use of rhythm. I tend to think very texturally when I'm writing for instruments that are not voices.
hmm
With this piece, there were some fun opportunities then for me to kind of play in this space about voices that sound like voices, as opposed to voices that sound um, like a texture. And rhythm often actually in this piece is used less as rhythm and more as some kind of textural element. There's a movement which the text is about fire in the flame, and the rhythm and the text and the setting of it is all about just creating this kind of sparking, almost like flickers and sparks, over coals, that kind of a texture. And the rhythm is all about that. Um, there's a movement which is on a text by Dogan Keegan. And there also, the text is about this moment of death, but embracing death as if it is almost a moment of joy, of exploration, of going to see what is going to happen next, rather than death as a moment of loss and darkness. And the rhythm and the energy comes from the text there in that case as well. And even just as I'm sort of talking about this, I think rhythmic writing for me comes so much. And anytime I'm working from a text, all of it comes so much from what is the text, what is the meaning of the text, what is the story of the text, and then what rhythm, what harmony, what technical elements will support that and bring that to life.
Hmm. Um, so we were talking before about nature, and it seems to me, as I think about it, and as I think about the piece as I understand it, there is something about the what you were talking about, a kind of our connection to nature, the harmony that you use, the span of time is fairly long. The harmonic rhythm is not fast or dense. Um, and I wonder if there is something about the interaction of those kind of expanses harmonically and the rhythmic activity that somehow feels very nature-like.
I love it. I hadn't thought of it that way.
Hmm.
Um, but I love it. And just as you're describing it, I mean, that feels authentic and that feels organic. Just thinking about even, we were talking about that experience of being out in the backcountry and looking up at the stars. Nothing moves quickly.
Right.
Everything feels, it is moving. And that's one of the things that's interesting. Of course, we know that everything is moving, but in the moment it feels and it looks very static.
Hmm.
So it was not intentional on my part, but I can
Yeah.
see that being kind of a subconscious connection.
Yeah, interesting. It just occurred to me as I was listening to you speak. Yeah. Wonderful. Are there other things you'd like us to be thinking about or our audience to be aware of as we perform and listen to this beautiful piece?
I mean, I hope they enjoy it. I hope the singers are enjoying it. I think there's a lot of variety in the course of this, the movements that you're doing that I think are just kind of fun. Just, I hope the audience will just be along for the ride. And if
Well,
somewhere after they leave, they wind up thinking about their connections to the stars and what that means, it would just be kind of a fascinating moment.
yeah, I think, there's always an anxiety, I think, in the world that if a piece is new, will I enjoy listening to it? I'm sure you've encountered that in the world. And I think we can assure the audience that they are really going to have a good time hearing it, and that this rhythmic element is, I think we often in music, we don't have a great way to talk about rhythm. We talk a lot about harmony and, in the inside baseball side of things, but there is something about your use of rhythm that is really satisfying, and that I think that will feel very joyful and fulfilling to listen to. So we're
Thank you
excited.
so much, Mark.
Yeah.
Me too. Thank you.
Okay, I'll stop the recording and I'll come back. Thank you, Juhi.